Now that we've finished up the modeling, it's time to add some basic materials. Now, right as I say that, I noticed one little thing that we missed in the last video, so let's go ahead and fix that now before moving forward. And that's that on our D-pad over here, we have some sharp edges that go around on these corners, but on this face it's soft because it's not over 30 degrees and it's not marked sharp. So just to rectify that, let's hit Tab to go into Edit mode, select these faces that need to be sharp, or these edges that need to be sharp. We have to do this in Edge Select mode, by the way, so make sure you're in that, and then right click and mark sharp. There we go. Now we're ready for some materials. So let's head over to our Materials tab, and right now everything is just assigned a basic default material. Let's name this something a little bit more specific, and if we look at our concept art here, let's 70 go to top view and kind of scroll over, we can see that we have a main orange material, a red material for the buttons, a gray material for the other buttons, a yellow material for the cartridge, and a very shiny material for the screen. So let's start out with that, and we can make adjustments later if we need to. So I'll take our default material here and just rename it to Plastic Orange. Then I'll go to the base color and make it a nice orange. I generally don't want to take the saturation all the way up to 1, as that can kind of mess with the renderer and give you results that aren't quite physically accurate. So I'll place it pretty close to that edge, but not all the way up to 1. Then in order to actually see this in the viewport, let's switch over to our material preview. Now we're not seeing it in the background right now, but our material preview has a nice HDRI background that's giving us these reflections. If we use the dropdown, we can see that the default is a very pretty forest path. But that's not really a good setting for this device, as it kind of tints everything a little bit green, and I'd rather use something that's more inside and more like a place that we'd want to actually use this in. So let's switch over to the indoor one. I think this one's going to help us better judge the reflections. Speaking of, now would be a good time to adjust the roughness. So I'll position my viewport where I can see a highlight kind of in the middle of the device, and then I'll go to the roughness and turn it up. That seems like it's way too soft, and if I turn it down, that's way too shiny. So I'll go with something about almost where it was, maybe 0.4 or 0.5-ish. I'd say a value of 0.4 is pretty good here. I was looking at references of like Game Boy Advance and those types of things, and they all had a pretty rough, very, very small texture to them, which kind of diffused the light a little bit, while the buttons were a little bit more shiny. So let's copy that. If you want, you could even make the base of the device metallic. This might be a really cool effect for yours, and you can color it however you want. But for now, I'll stick pretty close to the concept art and make it just a plastic. Then I'll add a new material for the A and B buttons. I'll click the plus button in the Material tab to add a new material slot, and then I'll click New to add a new material, and I'll rename this to Plastic Red. Then to assign the buttons to that material slot, I have to go into Edit mode, so I'll hit Tab and go into there. Select the top of the button, I'll go to Face Select mode, Shift select both of those tops, and then hit Control and plus on my number pad, and that's going to grow the selection. Now it's also selected the ring around the buttons. Then I can go back to the Plastic Red material slot and click Assign. Notice that when I select a face, it also jumps to the material slot that it's assigned to. So that's just a nice little shortcut here. Then I'll go to the Plastic Red material, take the base color and of course make it a nice red, and take the roughness and bring it down a bit. Probably to about 0.35 or so. If we wanted to make this a little bit extra red and kind of leave the grounds of reality here, but just really exaggerate how red this is, we could bring the saturation all the way to 1. Another thing that we could do if we really want to boost how red this looks is take the specular tint and increase that as well. Now that's a value that's completely physically unrealistic, so use that with caution, but it can definitely help just bring out the color a little bit more. If we go too high, then it'll start to look metallic. But for now, let's go ahead and assign colors to the other buttons as well. I'll click the plus button to add a new material slot, and this time let's just copy the Plastic Red settings, but then make it a gray. So I'll use the drop down instead of the new button, choose Plastic Red, so now the same material is assigned to both slots, but then I want to click the 2 button to make it a copy. But I can't do that in edit mode, so I'll go over to object mode. The 2 indicates that it's being shared by 2 materials, but then if I click that, then it makes it a unique material that's not linked to the other one anymore, and I'll change the name to .001, but I'll change it from Plastic Red to Plastic Gray. Then I'll go into edit mode again, and let's select the top of the Start and Select buttons. Again, hit Control plus to grow that selection. Go down to the Plastic Gray material and click Assign. Under the base color, let's change this to an actual gray. So under the HSV, I'll set the saturation all the way to 0, and just bring this down to maybe about 0.05-ish. Then we can do the same thing for the D-pad. I'll select the circle in the middle, as well as the inside of all of our triangles here. That way I can use the exact same trick of just hitting Control+. I'll do that 3 times to grow the selection all the way to the edges. Choose the plastic gray, and again click Assign. Let's not forget this button here at the top. I'll make this one a gray. Even though it's colored orange in the concept, I think it looks a little bit better as a gray. So I'll select that top face, Control+, head down to the plastic gray material slot, and click Assign. Then for these on the side, I'll make these a nice red. Again, select both the tops, Control+ on the number pad, plastic red, and Assign. Now we just have a couple more materials to work with. I'd like to add one for the screen. So I'll select that face, plus, click New, and this one I'll just call Screen. Then click Assign. I'll take the base color pretty far down. If we go all the way to black, then it won't be quite like an old screen because those could never produce a very deep black. So I'll just leave it as a dark gray. Then I'll take the roughness down a bunch. We'll work on the screen a bit more in the next video when we make a nice pixel effect for it. For now though, let's move on to assigning more materials. I'd like to add another one for the speakers here, even though in the concept art they're not that different from the original orange, but I'd like to make them look a little bit more like holes. So I'll assign a very matte dark gray. I'll add a new material slot, and name this one Speakers. I could go through and select all of these dots individually, but that would definitely be a bit of a pain. One shortcut for selecting a bunch of things is going to the Select menu, and then select Similar, and we could also select all of the faces that share some of these attributes. But it just so happens that in this case, we could just go to Side View, hit Z and toggle X-ray, zoom in here a bit, and just box select all the way through the bottom of these dots. Then we might get 1 or 2 faces by accident there, so I'll just box deselect any other faces, and to really quickly make sure that we have only the correct faces selected, I'll go to Wireframe View. Looks like I accidentally got some of these, so let's box deselect those. Just like so. And now since we have only the speakers selected, I can go down to the speakers material slot and again click Assign. Then I'll go to Solid View, toggle X-ray off, and let's go to actually Material Preview mode, there we go, and take the base color and make that a pretty dark gray, almost to black. Then I'll just take the roughness and bring that all the way up, because I don't want those to be very reflective. Then let's hit Tab to go to Object Mode. One thing you might notice is that our A and B didn't quite get the red material, and that's because we're using the Boolean modifier, and the Boolean modifier picks up the material of whatever's cutting into it, but in this case the button's Boolean doesn't even have a material, so it just picks the first material slot. So it's just kind of falling back a couple steps until it goes back to that original orange. So we could solve this in a couple ways. We could either just assign the red material to the button's Boolean object, plastic red, or we could have applied the Boolean modifier and just assigned the material that way. I don't think we really need the modifier anymore, so let's just go ahead and apply it. That'll help us avoid some confusing issues. For example, if we take the console itself and start to move it, then we'd also have to move the Boolean, and things get a little bit weird sometimes. So since we're pretty confident that this is what we want, let's go to our modifier properties, down to the Boolean modifier, use the drop-down, and click Apply. There we go. Now if we hit Tab to go into Edit mode, this is real geometry. We can now take that button's Boolean object and just hit Delete. Then we just have a couple more materials left, one of which being the screws on the undersides and the sides. We can't forget those. So let's select those, go to the Materials tab, and since they're all linked together, when I click New, and let's just call this material Screws, this material has been assigned to all of the other screws as well. So it doesn't matter which one we select, they're all sharing that exact same material. And that's because they're all instanced in sharing the exact same mesh. So this one will be pretty easy. We just need to take the base color, make it a little bit more of a darker gray or medium gray, bring the roughness down a bit, and increase the metallic value. I'll set that all the way to 1, zoom in a bit and kind of inspect how rough we should have this, and let's put it at about 0.2. And there we go. Let's do the cartridge. Let's select that object. And right now it's using the plastic orange. But if I hit the 2, which again signifies that this is shared between 2 material slots, in this case between 2 separate objects, then it'll make it its own copy. That way I can edit this independently of the other one. I can change the name to plastic yellow, and just make the base color a nice yellow, and maybe I'll desaturate it just a little bit so that it stands out from the orange a bit more. Then we just need to apply a material to this text. So let's select both of these objects here, use the material dropdown and choose plastic orange. And we'll do that for both of them. Or we could have used the dropdown and chose copy material to selected. That would have worked too. So at this stage, we could be done here if we were working in Eevee, but I actually want to render this in cycles, because that'll make it just a little bit more realistic, and we get one other cool feature that I want to show you. So at this point, let's switch over from our layout workspace to our shading workspace. That's the shading tab here at the top. And right now that jumps us into material preview mode and zooms us out quite a bit, but I'll hit period on the number pad to zoom right to the object that I have selected, and I guess nothing is selected here, so let's see, select the console and the outliner, period on the number pad, there we go. Now our view is nicely centered. Let's go to our material preview options and switch our little HDRI back to the room. Those shading options are different for every workspace. And now let's switch over to cycles. I'll head over to the render properties, switch the render engine from Eevee to cycles, and then switch over to the rendered view. Now it's using cycles and looks okay, but since we don't have any lights, it's really hard to see. We'll definitely add lights in a later lesson, but for now let's just use one of those preview HDRs. To use that in rendered view, let's use the dropdown and uncheck Scene World. That way it won't use the world that's in the Worlds tab in the Properties editor, which is just a flat gray. It'll use one of these preview HDRs. Now, since Cycles is a great path tracer, we're already getting some really nice soft shadows and accurate reflections and all of that stuff. But for this object just floating in space, it's not that much different from Eevee. The one feature that I really want to use though is the bevel shader. So we made some really big bevels in edit mode at the top of the device and at the top of the cartridge and in several areas. And we use those for the very large and smooth bevels. Then we also used the bevel modifier to make some of the smaller bevels around the buttons, around the side of the device. But now I want to take those razor sharp edges and soften them up just a little bit more. And we can do that with a shader-based bevel. First, let's demonstrate this on the red buttons. So I'll choose the plastic red material and zoom in here a little bit. And the whole scene is taking a little bit of time to actually clear up. So I'll use a little trick, which is the Control-B hotkey, and just draw a box around the thing that I want to focus on. That's going to really speed up the rendering around the part that I care about. Then to add a bevel in the node editor, which I know we haven't covered nodes at all yet, and that can be a pretty intimidating topic at first if you haven't used them before, but don't worry, we'll cover them extensively in the fundamentals of materials and shading. For now, just follow along with exactly what I do, with the understanding that we'll dive into all of this a lot more later. On the right, we have a node that represents our principled BSDF, and it's an exact copy of what we see over here in the properties editor. If we change one value here, it changes it over there as well. But it allows us to work in a little bit more of a flexible way. The thing that I want to do now is add a bevel shader. So let's go to Add, this is under Input, and Bevel. All these little colored dots on our principled shader are input sockets for these values, and then any socket on the right of the node is an output socket. So let's take the output of the bevel node, left click and drag, and put that into the normal of the principled shader. Now the principled shader is getting its normal, aka the direction that its faces are pointing according to the renderer, from the bevel node. We'll see an immediate effect, but it's not quite what we want. And that's because our device is really small. So even though the radius is 0.05, it's still way too big. So let's set this to 0.001. Now we can see that our button looks nice and rounded. I think this is a little bit too exaggerated, so let's bring it down even more. Let's try 0.0005. So 3 zeros. I think that looks about right, but you can adjust it for your own preference. Now I'd like to take this effect and apply it to the other buttons as well. So I'll take this node, and to easily copy this over to other materials, I'll just hit Control and C. Then to paste it into a different material, here I'll just go to the plastic gray, hit Control V to paste, and then plug the normal into the normal. And there we go. I'll hit Control B and look over, kind of over here at the D-pad, and I think that's looking pretty good. So now let's apply it to the other materials as well. We don't really need it on the screen or the speakers, so I'll head up to the plastic orange, hit Control V to paste, and plug the normal into the normal. At this point, my little preview window is a little bit too constrictive, so I'll hit Control Alt B and clear that out. Then I'll head up to the cartridge and add it there as well. Go to that yellow material, Control V to paste, and plug that normal into the normal. Lastly, we can't forget the screws, so let's head over to the side and zoom in on one of these. Maybe I'll use that Control B hotkey again, just to focus on just the screw. Select it, Control V to paste, plug the normal into the normal. And I think that looks a little bit too big, so let's dial it down. Let's try 0.0002. There we go, that looks a lot better. Then to clear that preview area, I'll hit Control, Alt, and B. And just like that, we have some basic materials. Now to clean up my workspace a little bit more before we move on to the next lesson, I'll get rid of some of these editors that we're not using. To do that, I'll right-click on the area between the two, when we get those little double arrows, and choose Join Areas, and then hover over the one that I want to get rid of. I'll do the same thing down here, right-click, Join Areas, hover over the image editor, and now we just have a bigger 3D view and a bigger node editor. I also want to clean up the outliner a little bit. I'll give us some more room, but I really want to make sure that if I move our console object, everything else should follow along. So I'll parent it. I'll select this top screw here, scroll all the way to the bottom where we have our start object, shift select it, that way I'm selecting everything in between, and then I want to make sure I'm selecting the cartridge object as well. So I'll hold Control to add to that selection, and select the cartridge, just like I would in like a file browser. And then to parent it to the console in the outliner, I can hold Shift, left click and drag drop that onto the console object. So just make sure you continue holding Shift while you drop, and there we go. Then I'll uncheck the references because we don't really need that anymore. And now we're ready to finish this up with a couple textures.